Good morning and welcome to Nyko's RPG. I am Jonathan Albin. Let's get started. Before we do that, go ahead and hit all the buttons to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience. And we are going to today talk about what does a game master do anyway? What's their purpose? What are they about? So let's get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Well, obviously I'm going to be changing my header in post-production. That wasn't the header that I just built. Oh well. We're going to start off with World War One. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there was a gentleman by the name of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder. And as a commander, he was writing a document that would explain definitively how one should execute a war plan. And ultimately, he came to the conclusion that the plan of operations extends only as far as the first encounter with the enemy's main force. Moltke's insight into military strategy applies just as well to tabletop role-playing games. A game master can design the most intricate plots, lay out carefully structured encounters, and anticipate virtually any player decision, only to watch the players forge their own unexpected and usually, to his plan at least, catastrophic course. But that's not a problem. It's the heart of what makes role-playing so compelling. Traditional role-playing games have long embraced this dynamic, blending structured rules with player creativity. The process by which we do this changes iterationally as we try new things. We look at new rule systems and such. And the Nyko's RPG system, for example, builds on the same foundation, taking it a step further into freeform storytelling, shared world building, and responsive narratives. The two approaches aren't at odds with each other, rather they represent different ways to approach the same love of adventure. To explore this further, we're going to talk about what makes a great game master, or what does a game master do. But we're going to do so in terms of three categories. We're going to talk about a game master's responsibilities, we're going to talk about his duties in that position, and the obligations he has both to himself, the story, and the players, as he goes about the process of shaping and building and creating the story. I'm getting better at this. At the core of every RPG is a shared experience, a collaboration between the players and the person that's guiding the story, whatever you call them. Whether structuring a ongoing campaign or perhaps a freeform one-shot, the game master is going to make sure that the table feels like a place where the players' contributions mean something. The way we do this is several different portions, but the idea of the responsibilities here is the first thing we need to be able to constantly and consistently do is foster a collaborative environment. Most classic RPGs provide a predefined world, whether it's Forgotten Realms, Golarion, Eberron, or other established setting. Game masters work within that structure, adjusting to fit the game to the group and the group to the game. Now, one of the dynamic differences between that and Nyko's RPG is that Nyko's removes those boundaries, no longer limiting you to a single concept in terms of backstory, that a realm, a difference that is solely up to the director. It gives the world a direct hand in changing and becoming what the players want it to be, not just the framework that's been devised already. The second thing that a group is required to do or desires to do, and the game master in particular is responsible for, encouraging creativity and role play. Many RPGs endlessly argue about the mechanics of the game, how the storytelling will be pursued, but very little about how that story mechanism assists with the player development. So, for example, skills checks, class features and limitations, and pre-written lore. In all of those cases, the game mechanics are outlining and framing the world setting. Whereas in other systems, such as Nikos, you would be in a situation where the player's actions inform the rule system instead of the opposite way around. The rule of cool establishes if it's cool, it works. And although that's not always the case, generally speaking, that does resolve it. But the next obligation that a game master has is to be open to feedback. In classic terms, adapting to player preferences often means you have to tweak the rules, adjust things. In the modern parlance, you have to homebrew. And that obligation extends to the point of making sure that the players have input. Many game masters, including myself, utilize a debrief structure where when the game is completed, then the players have an opportunity to give any input to how the game was played and what they would like to see different, or perhaps what they were entertained by in particular. And that entire feedback then provides a way for the games to become more excellent week over week over week. And that leads to, of course, the next obligation. A game master's obligation is to attempt, and this is a big ask, to make each session memorable. When you're running the same types of sessions week over week, they tend to fall into molds or routines or ruts, and the players have to find ways to deal with that. If you, on the other hand, are making every session unique and feel something that is permanent within the players and the story, then you avoid that difficulty. Okay, now we're going to talk about the actual duties. And the word duty is intentional. There are many people who come into the games environment think that everything should be almost thoughtless, that you should be able to just derive entertainment. Back to the wrong window again. Derive entertainment from the entire aspect, and so there shouldn't be any, as they would say, work involved. But the reality is that a game master has to put his life into the game in at least as much as giving the framework a life, giving the scenes something tangible for the players to hold on to. Now, once a solid foundation is placed, the game master has a duty to keep the story moving. Whether running a module or improvising a one-shot, keeping the game engaging means balancing player freedoms with meaningful structure. In other words, if you let one or more players just simply run roughshod, the story won't feel good for anyone else, because we're only, if you will, fulfilling one person's fantasy instead of everybody at the table. Whereas if we are all sharing together to build, then the game master simply guides and weaves the player's intent into the story so that it becomes whole. Now, this means that the game master has to encounter and encourage player agency in the system. Structured RPGs have several challenges, and one of which is that they tend to be structured, which means they have a what, when, where, why for everything that's written into the material. And the opportunity for choice and change to affect it really falls to the director or the game master. The storyteller has to therefore weave the story together to give it coherency, to give it a shape. The second duty of a storyteller is to adapt the story dynamically. when a player's action leaves the framework, goes off the veritable deep end, the knee-jerk reaction is to want to say, well, no, that can't happen because it doesn't fit in what I've got written here. But the reality is that it's the duty of the storyteller to nod and roll with it. Any game master knows that players rarely stick to plans. You know, the very concept of a plan itself is almost a farce, because players look for the way through. They're not necessarily thinking about what would fit a framework. When we look to, therefore, the duties of a game master, he has to be able to adapt and adjust on the fly. This perhaps is one of the most challenging portions of it, and for those game masters that are worth their salt, so to speak, they do this almost naturally, and you eventually become second nature. The next thing, of course, the next obligation is to create compelling environments and NPCs. When we talk about the non-entrained persons, the rest of the world, so to speak, compared to the characters, Game Master has to differentiate them at least as much as letting the players be able to identify them, perhaps by speech pattern, mannerism, or such. And so when we do that, we give them a way to link or attach to the story. It's no longer mine, it becomes ours, so to speak. And in some systems, that's very established. It's already been written. It's, you know, when you visit a certain place, as the saying goes, a rose is a rose. But in other mechanisms, perhaps the perspective is influenced by how the players engage with it. Did they come in through the front door, or did they come up climbing over a fence? Their perspective, therefore, on what they are encountering will change, much as the Blind Men in the Elephant poem by Rudyard Kipling, and I'll do an entire video on that here soon. Next duty, an obligation of the duty in particular of a game master is the managing the pacing of the adventure. In other words, create a story, and if you release all your data in the first 5 minutes, you have nowhere else to go, so to speak, in the story. So it's an idea of utilizing some method of unifying your data output so that the players receive the world in the way that somebody observing it might, instead of getting a lore dump of a million things that they wouldn't even be aware of. Now, in most role-play games, most of the properties that are out there, they utilize a turn-based mechanic so that time falls in a specific order and it doesn't get lost. As the saying goes, time was built. Time exists so that everything doesn't happen all at once. And that's also sort of the case in an adventure story. If you have written an adventure for a grand battle to take most of the adventure's time frame, but the players find a way to circumvent the battle altogether or simply choose to walk away, you have to be able to manage the pacing of the encounters so that the game flow matches the game time available for that particular session. And this is arguably one of the greatest obligations and duties of a storyteller. The next is to present meaningful challenges. It's one thing to throw people into a mixer and sit on the sidelines, kicking them back into play when they get near the edges without giving them context. But if your challenges, if your fight scenes are make sense, it goes back to the make story make sense, right? You're trying to provide the players with something that will be a difficulty or a challenge in the game session, but you do that so that the players meter along and get to the pieces in a way that helps them weave those pieces together to the conclusion. A conversation might become a battle. The battle might spark a new mystery. Everything is driven by the players. It's not something that the game master is intending to put out there, but the idea of the different challenges are the gauges by which the game master can direct it. Okay, finally we come to the obligations. And obligations is a funny word. It carries with it the idea of out of time. The idea is that when you have an obligation, it means something has already been provided to you and you are therefore obliged, therefore honor bound or required to do it. So obligations in this case bear a deeper meaning than perhaps the other two terms that we've referred to. So regardless of the structure, a game master has responsibilities. That's the term obligation to the players. These have to do more deeply with the actual play mechanism. The first thing is they have to maintain narrative integrity. If you described a building as being blue on the corner of the street, either come up with a reason for its change or merely remember the building is blue. That was a statement that gave the players a frame. And when you give them the frame, you can't really takesy-backsy. You need to make sure that they are able to hold on to that because it allows for the game to roll forward. Now, most RPGs have an established rule for how things work, what is acceptable, for example, how magic works, whatever politics or physics are in their local community. A storyteller has, therefore, the framework limitations of whatever system he's using to make sure that the players can engage with it. But once it's been shaped and framed, consistency becomes key. The next thing that players, of course, are concerned with is continuing to move forward in the story. And the player's experience of motion has more to do with action than it does with location. Turn-based game masters ensure this through everybody absolutely getting a turn in a sort of heavy-handed and seemingly arbitrary way. Just, we are going to do this, and you're going to act, and you're going to act, and you're going to act, and so on. But in games that are more open and role-play heavy, some players tend to fade into the background. The mechanism for this is difficult to put your head around when you're used to the turn-based mechanism, but a more fluid system literally requires the game master to be more aware of who is acting and make sure that everyone gets their actions in a timely fashion, ensuring that everybody participates and creating a more natural environment. In reality, yes, people may be standing on the sidelines, but even in a sidelines person might be a witness or aware of details that others might. So turning to each player sequentially in a game, whether you do it by a turn base or initiative base or whatever mechanism, the ensuring of player engagement is solely on the shoulders of the storyteller. Next, of course, would be the determination of what is right within the game world. This is the idea of interpreting rules fairly. Now, there's been a change in the newest version of Dungeons & Dragons in determining who the final arbiter is. And while I may disagree with it, nonetheless, it's endemic to that system. Endemic? I think it's the right word. The idea is that you need to have a system that interprets the rules fairly, which means a clearly defined frame. But once the frame is designed, the mechanism is really the part that becomes a challenge. Either it's either integral to the system and you think in those terms, and therefore you're not thinking in the role of a character, or you focus on the character aspect and look for keys to the mechanics in the narrative flow, which keeps the intuitive rather than the rules-heavy choice clearly in front of you. So that your group can actually operate smoothly, and there's no question about the stability of the system, so to speak. Which leads us to the next point, which of course is the idea of balancing. In traditional RPGs, balance is usually defined through a leveling system, encounter scaling, lots of math, lots of calculations, and consideration in ways that don't feel natural. Other systems remove those rigid frameworks and allow the players to grow through their developing within story, and such as a system like Nikos RPG, but we'll talk about that later. But the final thing that the game masters really are, what they're known for and what they are known for handling, is the facilitation of the conflict. Conflict resolution uses dice rolls, skills checks, and flat-out rules arbitration to resolve any disputes that occur in the game. Some of those are arcane and mechanical and clunky, and others are based more on the narrative and the understanding that the storyteller is fundamentally your final arbiter for these kind of things. Ultimately, the best RPGs are those that fit your group's style. Open, narrative-based, dialogue and drama, certainly one option, and a structured, linear, numeric, calculating, math equation is completely a cup of tea for others. But remembering that the original quote by Moltke says that no plan survives first contact, realize that there's more of a nuance to that than you might think. And we'll have a video specifically talking about that. But until then, why fight it? Whether you're using a structured adventure or freeform storytelling, do your planning right up to the point where you're going to engage, and then let the game go where it goes. Because that way you create a game where the players feel like their choices matter. The things they did change the future. There's no wrong way to play, but there's only one right way for your table. So reach out and take it and make your games excellent. I want to thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin. We'll see you next time.